Welcome to another deep dive. This time around, we're taking a look at a really fascinating topic, the brain. How it works, how we think, and how technology is helping us understand it all.
Yes, you've provided a really interesting mix of sources this time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, from historical perspectives on brain research to the latest cutting-edge neuroimaging techniques.
I have to say, in prepping for this one, I was struck by just how long scientists have been trying to figure out this connection between, brain activity and blood flow. Like, we're talking late 1800s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wild.
Roy and Sherrington were doing some groundbreaking work back in 1890, already doing animal experiments that hinted at a relationship between brain circulation and how much energy the brain uses.
Really? Wow. But then, I read about Leonard Hill, and his experiments actually set the field back for decades. Like, how does that even happen?
Well, Hill was a big name, very influential. And unfortunately, his experiments, while interesting, were flawed. He concluded that there was no link between brain function and circulation. And because of his stature, people believed him.
So an entire field was stalled because of one guy's bad conclusions.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, how often does that happen in science? It must be so tricky to challenge the status quo even when the evidence is shaky.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of healthy skepticism, right?
Yeah.
We always need to be questioning assumptions, digging into the methodology, and not just taking things at face value just because an expert said so.
Okay, well, let's jump forward past those dark ages to the tech that has really changed the game. Neuroimaging. You gave us sources on everything from CT scans to PD scans leading up to the rock star fMRI.
Each technology builds upon the last, giving us a more and more detailed picture of what's happening inside the brain. CT scans use X-rays to see the brain structure, while PET scans track radioactive tracers to map activity.
And fMRI, this is the one that measures changes in blood flow to infer brain activity.
Right.
Right, so if a brain area is working hard, it needs more blood, kind of like a muscle.
Exactly, yeah. The bold D signal, that stands for blood oxygen level dependent, that's what fMRI picks up on. More active neurons need more oxygen. So there's a rush of oxygen-rich blood to that area.
But isn't that a bit indirect? Like, how do we know that a change in blood flow really equals brain activity?
That's a great question. It is indirect.
Yeah.
And early research was overly simplistic. They thought if a brain area lit up on the fMRI, that was the area responsible for whatever task someone was doing.
So like a light switch on means active, off means inactive.
Exactly. But it turns out the brain is much more nuanced than that. Research in the late 1990s, specifically by Schulman and his team, found that some brain areas actually decrease activity during certain tasks. They go below their baseline level.
Wait, so some areas are powering up and others are intentionally powering down. What's the point of that?
That's the million-dollar question. It points to the brain working as a network, not just isolated regions. Some areas might be actively inhibiting others, almost like saying, hey, quiet down over there, I need to focus.
So it's like a symphony orchestra. Some instruments playing loud, others soft, all coordinated to create the overall effect. I'm starting to see why that simple light bulb idea wasn't quite accurate.
Yeah, and this leads to another fascinating discovery that challenged some old assumptions. For a long time, we thought oxygen was the fuel for active brain areas. But research in the 1970s found that during brain activity, blood flow and glucose use increased way more than just oxygen consumption could explain.
Hold on, so it's not just about oxygen. There's another energy source involved.
It seems so. This led to the study of glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose,
Yeah.
as playing a bigger role than we initially thought. It's like the brain has this backup generator just in case the main power goes out.
And then there's the research on astrocytes, these star-shaped cells that support neurons. What role do they play in all of this?
Magistretti and his colleagues have done some fascinating work showing how astrocytes might actually be supplying energy to those busy neurons. It's like a pit crew, making sure the race car has enough fuel to keep going.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the different types of neuroimaging, but let's zero in on fMRI since it seems to be central to a lot of what you're interested in.
Good point. While fMRI is powerful, we have to understand its limitations. Remember, the Boldy signal is indirect. It's not measuring neuronal activity directly, just the changes in blood flow.
So it's like watching the crowd at a concert cheer rather than hearing the music itself. You know something exciting is happening, but you're not getting the raw experience.
That's a great analogy. There's a time lag between when neurons fire and when that Boldy signal changes. Plus, different brain areas have different blood vessel densities, so the signal can vary. And fMRI is very sensitive to motion, which can mess up the data.
So it's a powerful tool, but not a perfect one. It's like those old blurry photos. You get the general idea, but the details are fuzzy.
Exactly. But researchers are always working on new techniques and analyses to improve fMRI and overcome these limitations.
Okay, so we have this amazing tool. But how do scientists actually design experiments for fMRI? I imagine it's not as simple as saying, okay, think about a cat and let's see what lights up.
You'd be surprised how much thought goes into designing these tasks. The challenge is to isolate specific cognitive processes.
So if I'm studying memory, I need a task that makes people use their memory, but not a bunch of other brain functions at the same time.
Exactly. Early studies use what's called block designs, where you do one task for a while, then switch to a different task. This gives a good signal, but it's hard to separate out the different stages of a complex process.
And I read about event-related designs where different stimuli are presented kind of randomly.
Right.
Does that help with this issue?
It does. Event-related designs are like snapshots. You can see the brain's response to each individual event. But like any tool, each design has its pros and cons, and the choice depends on what you're studying. For example, Kapoor and colleagues used block designs in their 1994 study, while Dem and colleagues in 1995 opted for event-related designs.
All right, so we've got the technology, the study design down. Now let's get to the fun part. What have we actually learned about how the brain works? I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of functional specialization,
Yeah.
that different brain areas have specific jobs.
That's been a core concept in neuroscience for a long time, and neuroimaging has really let us map those specializations with incredible precision.
Okay, give me some examples. What kind of specializations have we found?
Well, one of the most famous is the fusiform face area, or FFA.
Mm-hmm.
Research by Kanwisher and her colleagues showed that the FFA is much more active when people look at faces compared to other objects. It's like there's a part of our brain dedicated to recognizing faces.
That's so cool. And what about other types of visual information?
There's the parahippocampal place area, or PPA, which Epstein and Kanwisher found responds specifically to scenes and places.
Okay.
So your brain seems to have different areas for recognizing faces versus recognizing your surroundings.
And I read about areas that process different categories of objects, like tools versus animals.
Right, Martin and his team have shown distinct brain activity patterns for those categories.
Uh-huh.
It's like your brain has different filing cabinets for different types of information.
So we have specialized areas for faces, places, tools, animals. It's amazing how organized the brain seems to be. But is it really that neat and tidy? I mean, surely these areas must interact somehow.
You're absolutely right. While there's specialization, it's not like a rigid map. There's overlap, interaction, and the brain is incredibly adaptable.
So it's more like a complex web of connections with areas specializing but also working together.
Exactly. And that brings us to the concept of brain networks, which we'll dive into more next time.
Okay, so we left off talking about brain networks, and it sounds like this is where things get really interesting, how these specialized areas we were talking about actually work together.
Absolutely. Think of it like a city.
Okay.
You've got different districts specializing in different things, but they're all connected by roads and communication networks. The brain is similar. It's all about how these specialized areas communicate and interact.
So it's not just about identifying which areas light up, but like understanding the traffic patterns between them. How do scientists even begin to study something that complex?
Well, there's some pretty cool techniques. For example, structural equation modeling, or SEing, lets researchers study how different brain regions influence each other during a task. It's like analyzing the flow of goods and services between those specialized districts in our city analogy.
So they can see which areas are sending signals to which other areas and how strong those connections are.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that these networks aren't static. They're constantly changing and adapting based on what we learn and experience.
So our brain is literally rewiring itself as we go through life.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
One study by McIntosh and colleagues found that the interactions between brain regions involved in spatial versus object vision were different depending on a person's level of expertise. It's like the more you use certain brain pathways, the more efficient and well-traveled they become.
And there's that technique called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where they can actually stimulate one brain area and see how it affects others.
Right. Poas and his team did some really interesting work with TMS, showing how stimulating one area can directly influence activity in other connected regions. It's almost like sending a targeted pulse through that city network and seeing which lights flicker in response.
So it's not just a static map, it's a dynamic, ever-changing system. That makes me wonder about individual differences, like my brain's network must be wired a bit differently from yours, right?
Absolutely. Even though our brains have the same basic structure, there's a lot of variation in how those connections are organized.
Hmm.
And that can lead to fascinating differences in how we process information.
Like some people are better at math, others are more artistic, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And even something as fundamental as language processing can vary across individuals. Studies on sex differences in language processing have found both similarities and differences in how men and women use their brains for language.
Wait, really? So there is a difference between male and female brains when it comes to language?
Well, it's complicated. Some studies, like those by Shaywitz and colleagues, found differences in lateralization. That means men might rely more on one hemisphere of the brain for language, while women show more activity in both hemispheres.
But other studies have shown that men and women are pretty similar, right?
Yes. Research by Price, Buckner, and Frost, among others, found remarkable similarities in how men and women process language despite any anatomical variations.
So the jury's still out on that one. It makes me wonder, what does this mean for how we each process language, regardless of gender? It's like everyone has their own unique language map in their brain.
It's a fascinating area of research,
All
and
right.
it highlights how neuroimaging is challenging our assumptions about how the brain works.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this whole brain network idea is so important, but let's get practical for a second.
Okay.
Why should we care about all these intricate details? How does understanding brain networks actually help people?
Well, for one thing, it has huge implications for cognitive training and learning. If we know which brain areas and networks are involved in specific tasks, we can design educational programs or therapies that are much more targeted and effective.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach to learning, we could have personalized programs tailored to each person's brain.
Exactly. Imagine being able to identify someone's strengths and weaknesses based on their brain activity patterns, and then create a customized learning plan that plays to those strengths and helps them overcome those weaknesses.
That's pretty amazing. It's like having a personal trainer for your brain. Are there any real-world applications of this yet?
Absolutely. Neurofeedback is a great example. It's a technique where people can see their own brain activity in real time and learn to regulate it. It's being used to help people with ADHD, anxiety, even chronic pain.
Wait, so you can actually train your brain to function better, kind of like training a muscle.
That's the idea. By learning to control specific brainwave patterns, people can improve their focus, reduce stress, and manage their symptoms more effectively.
That's incredible. What about those brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, that I've been hearing about? Are those actually a thing now?
They are. BCIs allow people to control external devices like prosthetic limbs or computers using only their thoughts.
So someone who's paralyzed could potentially control a robotic arm just by thinking about moving their arm.
Exactly. It's still a relatively new field, but the progress being made is astounding.
It sounds like science fiction becoming reality. But with all this talk about decoding brain signals and controlling devices with our minds, are we getting a little ahead of ourselves? I mean, how much can we really tell from a brain scan?
You're right to be cautious. Neuroimaging's are powerful, but it's not a crystal ball. We can see which areas are active, but we can't read someone's thoughts or feelings directly. It's more like seeing the lights of a city from above. You know something's happening, but you don't know exactly what.
So it's more about patterns of activity than specific thoughts.
That's right. And we always have to remember that every brain is unique. Just because one area lights up in a certain way for one person doesn't mean it'll be the same for everyone else.
So we need to be careful about making generalizations based on what we see in brain scans.
Absolutely. It's important to consider individual differences and not overinterpret the findings.
Okay, all of this is incredibly fascinating, but it also brings up some pretty big questions. I mean, with all this talk about brain networks, brain-computer interfaces, and AI, are we on the verge of some kind of technological singularity where machines become smarter than humans? Is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that sparks a lot of debate. The field of AI has definitely been influenced by our understanding of the brain, and as we learn more, the potential for creating truly intelligent machines becomes more real.
So are we talking about a HAL 9000 situation here? Is that something we should even be aiming for?
It's a topic with a lot of ethical considerations. Some experts think true artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is still a long way off, while others think it's just around the corner.
It's a bit unsettling, to be honest. Like, what happens if we create machines that can think for themselves? Do they become a threat or a partner?
That's why it's crucial to have open and honest conversations about the potential benefits and risks of AI, involving experts from all fields, not just computer science, but also neuroscience, ethics, and philosophy.
We need to make sure we're not opening a Pandora's box that we can't close. But let's step back from the singularity for a second and talk about something a bit more hopeful: neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to change and adapt.
Exactly. It's one of those amazing things about the brain. It's not a static organ. It's constantly rewiring itself based on our experiences.
So it's not like we're stuck with the brain we're born with. We can actually change it.
Absolutely. Neuroplasticity means we have the power to shape and mold our brains through our choices and actions.
So even if we've developed bad habits or negative thought patterns, we can still retrain our brains.
Exactly. It's never too late to learn new things, break old habits, and create new, healthier pathways in the brain.
That's so empowering, but how do we actually do that?
There's a growing body of research on how to harness neuroplasticity. Things like exercise, meditation, learning new skills, and even spending time in nature have been shown to promote neuroplasticity and enhance cognitive function.
So it's not just about high-tech brain training gadgets. We can actually rewire our brains through lifestyle changes.
Exactly. Taking care of our physical and mental health is crucial for brain health. And the good news is we have more control over it than we might think.
This is also inspiring. It's like a whole new world of possibilities has opened up. But are there any limits to neuroplasticity? Does it slow down as we get older?
Well, neuroplasticity is definitely strongest during childhood, but it continues throughout life, even as we age. It might take a bit more effort and time, but it's definitely possible.
So it's never too late to teach an old dog new tricks.
Exactly. Embracing lifelong learning and challenging ourselves mentally is one of the best things we can do for our brains.
That's good to hear. But I have to admit, with all this talk about neuroplasticity and brain training, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. It's like
I,
there's so much pressure to constantly be optimizing our brains.
I understand. It's important to find a balance. It's great to be proactive about brain health, but we don't need to obsess over constant optimization. Sometimes the best thing we can do for our brains is to relax, disconnect, and let them wander.
That sounds like excellent advice. But before we all go off and take a mental break, I want to circle back to one of the main themes of this deep dive: how technology is impacting our understanding of the brain.
It's a fascinating and rapidly evolving landscape, isn't it?
It is.
We've talked about neurofeedback, brain-computer interfaces, and AI, but those are just a few examples of how technology is shaping the field of neuroscience.
What are some of the other emerging trends that you're excited about?
Well, one area that's really taking off is the development of new neuroimaging techniques that are even more sensitive and precise than fMRI.
Oh, like what?
There's a technique called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRs.
Okay.
It uses near-infrared light to measure brain activity.
So it's kind of like a smaller, more portable version of fMRI.
In a way, yes. FNIRS is less expensive and doesn't require those big, clunky scanners, which makes it more accessible for research and clinical use.
And I've heard about optogenetics, which sounds absolutely wild.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Optogenetics is a revolutionary technique. It allows researchers to control the activity of specific neurons using light.
Wait, you can turn neurons on and off with light? How does that even work?
It involves genetically modifying neurons to express light-sensitive proteins. By shining light of specific wavelengths onto these neurons, researchers can either activate or inhibit their activity.
That's insane. What are the implications of this technology?
It's opening up incredible new possibilities for understanding how brain circuits function. And it holds immense promise for developing new treatments for neurological and psychiatric disorders.
It sounds like we're entering a whole new era of brain research with tools that allow us to manipulate neural activity with incredible precision.
It's a truly exciting time to be studying the brain. And as we continue to unravel its mysteries, I think we'll see even more groundbreaking applications of technology in neuroscience, medicine, and beyond.
This has been such a stimulating conversation. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this vast and complex topic.
We have covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to explore. I think it's time to take a break and let all this information sink in.
Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve even deeper into the implications of these discoveries and leave you with some thought-provoking questions to ponder. Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the history of brain research to the latest in neuroimaging and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing to think how far we've come in understanding this complex organ.
It's truly remarkable. And yet, there's still so much we don't know.
Exactly. We've talked about how neuroimaging can show us these patterns of brain activity, but does that really bring us any closer to understanding consciousness. What is consciousness anyway?
Ah, the age-old question.
Right.
Philosophers and scientists have been wrestling with that one for centuries. Neuroimaging gives us incredible insights into the brain's activity, but it hasn't yet cracked the code of consciousness itself.
So we can see the brain lighting up, but we still don't really understand how those electrical and chemical signals create, like, the subjective experience of being aware.
That's the mystery. Some theories suggest that consciousness arises from the complex interactions in specific brain regions, while others propose it's an emergent property of the entire brain working together.
It's like we have all the pieces of the puzzle, but we're still missing the picture on the box. But even without fully understanding consciousness, haven't these neuroimaging advances led to some amazing breakthroughs in treating brain disorders?
Absolutely. We've already touched on neurofeedback and brain-computer interfaces,
Right.
but there's so much more. For example, researchers are using neuroimaging to find early signs of Alzheimer's disease, which could lead to earlier diagnosis and intervention.
That's incredible. Early detection is key for so many diseases.
And neuroimaging is also being used to create more personalized treatment plans for conditions like depression and anxiety, based on each individual's unique brain activity patterns.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we're moving towards treatments that are tailored to each patient's brain. That's amazing. But I have to wonder, as we develop these increasingly powerful tools, are we messing with something we shouldn't? Are we crossing a line?
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
As with any scientific advancement, there are ethical considerations that we need to address. We need to ensure these technologies are used responsibly, with respect for human dignity and autonomy.
Right. It's not just about what we can do, but what we should do.
Exactly.
We need to be mindful of the potential consequences. Speaking of consequences, I can't help but think about the potential for AI to surpass human intelligence. Is that a real possibility, or is it just science fiction?
The singularity, as it's often called, is a topic that generates a lot of discussion, and for good reason. As we understand more about the brain and develop more sophisticated algorithms, the idea of machines that think like humans becomes more and more plausible.
It's a bit of a scary thought, isn't it? What happens if we create machines that are smarter than us? Do they become our partners or our rivals?
Those are big questions. Some experts think that artificial general intelligence, or AGI, could pose a real threat to humanity, while others believe it could help solve some of our biggest challenges.
It's almost like we're playing with fire, and we need to be extremely careful.
That's why it's crucial to have open and honest conversations about the potential benefits and risks of AI,
Right.
involving experts from a wide range of fields, not just computer science, but also neuroscience, philosophy, ethics. We need to approach this with a lot of thought and caution.
Absolutely. We can't just blindly rush into the future without considering the potential consequences. But on a more positive note, what are some of the most exciting developments in brain research that you see on the horizon?
Well, one area that's particularly fascinating to me is the connection between the brain and the gut microbiome.
The gut microbiome. You mean the trillions of bacteria that live in our intestines?
That's right.
What does that have to do with the brain?
It turns out those bacteria play a much bigger role in our health and well-being than we ever realized. And recent research has shown a direct link between the gut microbiome and brain function.
Wait, are you saying that what we eat can actually affect our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors?
It's not quite that simple. But the gut microbiome produces various neurochemicals that can signal to the brain, influencing everything from mood to cognition to our immune system.
That's mind-blowing. So taking care of our gut health is just as important as taking care of our brain health.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. And I believe that understanding this relationship between the brain, the gut, and the microbiome will lead to new and innovative treatments for all sorts of conditions, from depression to Alzheimer's and beyond.
Wow, that's incredible. It seems like we're on the cusp of a whole new frontier in understanding the brain and its connections to the rest of the body.
It's a truly exciting time for neuroscience. And as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the brain, I have no doubt we'll see even more groundbreaking discoveries and applications in the years to come.
This has been such an incredible journey, and I feel like I've learned so much about this amazing organ that we all carry around in our heads.
It's been a pleasure exploring these topics with you.
And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of the brain. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Until next time.